another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Ein Podcast über alte Spiele von zwei alten Männern. Stay Forever mit Gunnar Lott und Christian Schmidt.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Stay Forever podcast, in English for a change. So over the past weeks we've been playing Bloodnet, which turned out to be a pretty unique and captivating experience, and we ran into a lot of questions about the game's design. So we decided to invite two of the makers of Bloodnet to talk about the game. Laura, John, I'm very happy to have you on the show.
Thank you, Christian. Likewise.
We're pleased to be here.
Since I will very likely mispronounce your last names, can I ask you to briefly introduce yourselves? Who are you and what was your role on Bloodnet?
My name is Laura Kampo. At the time when we were with MicroProse, John and I were the game designers when the game was released in 1993.
Yeah, right. I'm John Antinori, and I think Laura covered it. I mean, she and I were collaborators. We designed it and wrote it.
As far as I know, Bloodnet was not the first game that either of you worked on. So I'm curious, how did you get started in the games industry and what did you do prior to Bloodnet?
We were very young, so we didn't do a lot before then. My best friend FJ and Laura's husband, who was FJ, and his friend Mark started a computer games company while we were in college. And we did a few other games that were like text adventures and I think one RPG prior to Bloodnet. But yeah, we were just a bunch of 20-somethings in Latrobe, Pennsylvania with a startup computer game company. We would eventually go on to license some Marvel Comics games and do some bigger things. But, you know, this was probably maybe for me, at least the third game that I was involved in.
Same here. Before I was doing games, I was handling the PR for the company. Before that, I was an advertising copywriter because you have to understand at the time, being a game designer was not a legitimate endeavor yet. You couldn't study it in school. We were on the fringes of society, kind of. I don't know about you, John, but I had to explain to my parents what I was doing for a living, right?
I've been doing that for quite a while, yeah. But yes.
Now you can major in it at Carnegie Mellon.
Everything was R&D, even like how we would do the packaging and what kind of box we would put it in and what your supply chain would be. It was a really fun early moment of the PC games business.
That first games company which you mentioned, what was the name of that company?
Paragon.
Paragon Software.
That's right. They did Mega Traveler.
Yeah, Mega Traveler, Marvel Comics, Twilight's Ransom.
Yeah, I wrote the manual for that one.
And how did you get from Paragon to MicroProse?
They were originally our distributor, and then they acquired us. So we were like a studio under MicroProse's label.
And then they immediately went bankrupt, and we ended up, like within a year, taking back the assets and forming Take-Two, which still exists and publishes under the Rockstar label.
And a lot of people don't realize that Take-Two really started in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And their owner was in New York, and they branched out from there. But they grabbed up our little studio, and that was where Take-Two started.
So wait a second. I need to roll back there quickly. So you were bought by MicroProse, and then you went bankrupt. MicroProse existed for quite a while. So how does that fit together?
After they bought us, like it was clear once we were on the inside, their business wasn't very healthy. They had tried to go into a arcade business, and they essentially were going to lay us all off. And so instead of doing that, we just asked them to give us back control of our assets. And FJ, Laura's husband, and Mark Ceremit, who was his partner, went looking for somebody else to invest in us. And we ended up forming Take-Two from that.
Didn't MicroProse get acquired by Spectrum Holobyte then?
I don't know.
Well, we ended up our little shop was the beginning of Take-Two. A lot of people don't realize that.
I didn't know that. That's a great origin story, actually. That's an entirely different story. But in the confines of the story that we're talking about, I'm very much interested in the MicroProse era, essentially, when you were working there. So to quickly set the stage and get an idea of the setting in which this takes place, what was it like working at MicroProse at that time? So, for instance, how did the office look like and how did the teams work?
Well, we were our own separate studio. And then 4-hour drive away in Hunt Valley, Maryland was MicroProse. And their lab was working on Civilization at the time. And I don't know, we had a really nice relationship. They let us do our thing. Yep. Pretty much. We didn't realize how good we had it until you moved on to other things where people are in everything you do. They just let us pretty much do our thing.
And they were in the same office park as the McCormick Spices company. So when you pulled, every time you pulled into the lot, it was just fragrant with Paragon
garlic
or garlic or whatever spice.
Or cinnamon.
Yeah. But yeah, it was a good year working with them. And I would say, we had a producer, Lauren Schick, who actually, anticipating maybe a potential question, Lawrence actually came up with the idea of doing a cyberpunk vampire game. He was assigned to us by MicroProse as a producer, and we were having lunch in the Olive Garden in Latrobe, PA, and he said, do cyberpunk vampires, because back then the Anne Rice novels were big. We thought that was a good idea, and we ran with it.
It was also the time, in about 92, the Francis Ford Coppola, Bram Stoker Dracula came out, you remember?
Yep.
Keanu Reeves and his excellent accent. And so the vampire thing was just starting. And this whole cyberpunk thing was new. We had to define what it was. We had to explain things that are now commonplace about decking your brain into the computer and all kinds of things. So we just melded two things that were, I would say, trending.
Lawrence Schick, who you mentioned, who is credited for the game as producer of role-playing games.
That's
so
right.
He was sitting in Maryland in the head office.
Yes, the head office, yes.
And he suggested that to you as a follow-up to Challenge of the Five Realms, I guess. That was the first game that he worked on for MicroProse.
Probably. I don't know if it was the first one, but it was certainly one of the first, yeah. We weren't part of MicroProse with Challenge. They were distributing for us. So, like, if you look at the box, it was like Microplay. That was their label.
Oh, right. Okay. So that was still created and developed under Paragon.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. And then he suggested this combination of cyberpunk and vampires. How did you react to that idea?
I don't remember. Was the cyberpunk thing in there or just vampires? I forget.
No, it was Cyberpunk, and we said, sure.
Okay.
And then I called one of my best friends and said, what the hell is Cyberpunk? I had no idea what it was. But I think we just said, sure, that sounds great. We knew vampires were big, and we vaguely knew what Cyberpunk was. So
I remember one cultural reference of cyberpunk at the time was that steampunk was happening. So, everything with sepia tones and rusted metal and industrial age. Do you remember the Smashing Pumpkins video, Tonight? It looks like a silent movie. Anyway, this kind of stuff was new, that whole throwback steampunk thing. So that was part of it too.
Okay, and then you made it your own. And that idea of actually referencing the original Bram Stoker Dracula story, was that yours?
Well, what we did was, I remember reading everything we could that was vampire related and then watching every movie, every old one. So you'll find that we took some of the character names like Van Helsing, but used them in a different way. I mean, I watched everything. The Anne Rice novels had just come out. Is that right? Around then too, John?
yes.
And I remember, there's even a disco Dracula movie, Love at First Bite. I loved that one as a kid. That had some influence.
Oh, yes.
You remember that one?
I do. I didn't watch it for prep, but like Susan St. James is in that.
Yes,
I think
George Hamilton.
she's gorgeous. Yeah.
Two-tan George Hamilton. And so we studied everything and soaked everything up, and then we mishmashed some stuff, we changed some things, and we made it our own thing.
You definitely did. That's one of the things which fascinated us, I think, the most about the game. That's the story and the elements that went into it. When we played the game, it took us a long time to realize that the game story is, in fact, ultimately a continuation of the Dracula story, just set 200 years in the future. And I mean, the name Van Helsing, you already mentioned, that's there from the very beginning, but we initially just thought that's kind of an ironic reference or something. And only in the last third of the game did we start piecing the clues together and understand that Van Helsing is in fact the Van Helsing from the novel. And then it becomes obvious with the Dracula reveal at the end, which is the game's twist in a sense. But we were quite taken with the idea of the vampire hunter Van Helsing succumbing to the dark side. And it was a bit of a pity when we realized that his character is not really fleshed out and he dies in the end in the final battle without any further explanation or last words or something like that. So yeah, that was really a bit of a pity.
That's sad.
Yeah.
We left you hanging. That's terrible.
I don't know how much you had planned to actually take the plot of Dracula and continue telling it.
From my end, I don't think we did intentionally. I've never read Dracula, and I read some of the Anne Rice novels, but intentionally stayed away from source material because I didn't want it to, inadvertently be feeling something, right? So
wow, you stayed pure, huh? You stayed pure.
Well, I don't know, pure. Like I didn't read any of the William Gibson novels, for example, because like he was obviously the big cyberpunk writer.
Mm-hmm.
But we did a lot of like, was it Mondo 2000? There were some magazines that were like about the cyberpunk world, right? So psychotropic drugs and various things. Those were terrific. So read a lot of those things and always liked computers and coding. So read books about hackers and all that just to get deeper into code. But I personally just stayed away from anything about Dracula or anything like by William Gibson or anything because I just didn't want to, inadvertently steal stuff from them.
Okay.
I was the opposite. And I can't speak to where we got the references on this whole street drugs thing. Jeez Louise, is that politically incorrect or what?
No, Mondo 2000 had tons of stuff about like vasopressin and what's all in Lexapro now, right? Things that affect your brain and make it better without destroying it. So there was a lot of that shit out there that I think we threw all of it in the game.
And do you remember the word nanotechnology was starting to enter the vernacular?
That was so new. It blew my mind. Yeah, it felt so, all of it felt so leading edge. Yeah, you're right. I forgot nanotechs. Yeah. That was a whole new thing.
Yeah.
Still kind of is.
Indeed it is. Yeah. And it's in the game already. That's true. So you mentioned already that was kind of unusual at the time to be a game designer. And you're not just credited as game designers for Bloodnet, it's game designers and writers, essentially, which is even more unusual to have more than one person and then for both of these roles on a game. So how did your corporation work? Who did what in terms of design and writing for the game?
Our corporation, yes.
It was so hands-on. And when you think of now, we just did everything. I mean, there was a ton of time of John and I locked in a room with giant whiteboard figuring everything out, the arc of everything, breaking things up. And we would just set aside time and just kind of hash everything out. But when we got to actually writing, the way we did it was we were in an editor. So we were actually, as we were writing the dialogue, we were writing the logic branches, if then, so we can make it as layered as we want. So we're doing like very simple coding at the same time that we were building the words.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
It was fun.
The artists were fabulous. They were working with like 3D Studio Max before it had like a preview function. So they would have to go in and pull some vertices and re-render it out and then wait and see if it was any good and then have to go back in and do it again. The developers were fantastic and they would build, as Laura said, pseudocode editors where we would go in and just write the copy right into a bespoke tool. So yeah, that was, as she said, was a lot of fun. But mostly everyone just worked around the clock.
Yeah, we didn't sleep. We didn't have lives.
Yeah, we worked at night. And because these things had to be out at Christmas, right around June when the weather got nice in Western Pennsylvania, you were working until midnight every weekend. So it was glamorous.
It was. And you know what? Right now, I was thinking, now if you would call this iteration, but we would just go ask the programmers, hey, we need another function. Can you add this extra layer into the editor? They would do it, and we'd get a new version of the editor, and then we basically added either a skill or a function or a combat aspect or something, like on the fly.
It was agile.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Everything was on the fly. Yeah.
That sounds like both of you were doing almost everything in terms of game design and writing, but are there parts of the game where you would say that's my own? So is there something that's specifically, typically Laura Kampo and something that's so John Antinori?
Definitely characters. We divvied up the characters, right?
I don't even remember, Laura. I mean, my stuff's obviously great. So I mean, but how to point that out, I don't know. I honestly don't remember how we divvied it up.
You know what else I remember? Microsoft Project had just come out. You remember that? So we were starting to be able to clock our progress, and you still had to report in how far along you were with everything, but we would divvy up hundreds of characters. Did you write our lead character there, Stark, or did we divide that up?
I don't know, but I know that Ransom Stark's photo is a photoshopped version of the photo from my first wedding, so it was that.
Everybody did everything.
Pretty much the whole company's photos are in there somewhere. Right. And also, and I might as well say this now, by the way, we were very concerned. The original box, the fellow who was one of our earlier designers and did our box designs, completely ripped off. There was a photograph of Eric Clapton on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. And if you search that and look at the cover of the original Bloodnet, it was so much ripped off from that from the photo. We were worried we were going to get sued.
I mean, it's Clapton with fangs. Yeah.
That's great. Let's speak about characters, because I have to say, we had so much fun with the dialogues in the game. I mean, there is stuff to criticize about the game. We'll come to that. But one thing that I feel is holding up extremely well to this day is the writing. That's one reason why we were so keen to speak with you. The writing shines when it comes to creating quirky but also realistic characters which have to seem a place in the world and an agenda, and they speak with their own recognizable voice. And I feel that for the vast majority of adventure games out there, dialogue is something that gets in the way of gameplay. So the sooner it's over, the better. Not so in Bloodnet, where we were actually looking forward to speaking to new characters. And we would have loved to hear much more commentary from our party members. So my question would be, do you still recall how you approached character design?
I think we would say, I want this one to be a mishmash of a type of somebody we knew or somebody in popular culture or something like that. And then we would just have fun with it. Do you remember, John?
So first of all, thank you. I'm so happy to hear you say that you enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, please. I forgot to say that. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Honestly, that actually means a hell of a lot 20 years later, whatever it is. But
25.
I remember, well, one, like these games were on floppy disks, right? Like this was the last game before CD-ROMs. We didn't have a lot of animation. We didn't have a lot of graphics. It was like a step up from text adventures. So the text was a lot of it. You know, and Laura and I are both writers and writerly people. I just remember sitting in a room with really loud music, and you're trying to offer 50 hours of gameplay. So you got to load it up. Basically, you could throw every idea you had into it. I just remember having a hell of a lot of fun just saying, okay, yeah, here's Milwaukee Jack. He's a killer, and just throw any kind of crazy shit you wanted in there. And because there was like hours more of stuff that might work.
You're right. We didn't overthink it because we had to move.
So one of the things where you went almost over the top in terms of characters is the number of people that you can recruit for your party. Because even when you start the game, there's quite a lot to choose from. I think like a dozen or something. And then as you play the game keeps adding more. And in the end, it's 26 people which you can recruit. That is a lot by RPG standards. And we were really wondering why. Why so many?
We just went overboard. I don't know why.
Yeah, it was Laura's idea, and it was clearly a mistake. So
we want to have absolutely no life.
Yeah, that's right, Laura.
Why did we do that to ourselves?
Yeah, when you get older, you realize keep it simple. Yeah, I don't know. I think we were just having fun, and again, back then you were trying to the promise was always this was a big game, and you could play it for a long time.
And you know what? We were right at this split between genres. You know, we're not pure RPG. We could have gone either way, more hardcore RPG, but we went the other way. So I don't know where we decided what we were keeping that was which side of the fence, John. I don't remember actually having a decision-making process. Do you remember that? Which way we're going to lean?
I don't, but I think it was just organic because we had done RPGs and those had combat systems and all that. I actually think it makes Bloodnet a better game. We never did a Bloodnet sequel, but we did Hell and Ripper after that, which were also Cyberpunk Demons and Cyberpunk Jack the Ripper. And I personally feel like Bloodnet's a stronger game because it has the adventure elements, but it has the RPG elements, the combat system, and the skills. Whether or not those systems worked or were as strong as other games, I just thought that made it a better game. So yeah, but I think we just naturally did it.
But that was not a mandate from MicroProse to have an RPG adventure mix. That was your call.
Yeah,
I think whatever was going on in MicroProse, Lawrence fought the good fight for us down there, right? Whatever happened down there, he kind of let us be spared. And I don't know how much he had to struggle or anything, but we just kept on working and we didn't get much lack. The biggest concern was time. And then people don't realize this at the time, but the size of the game meant more cost of goods. Yeah. I don't know what it was. It was something like $1 a disc, wasn't it?
Yeah.
For cost of goods. So that keep checking on the size of the game was going to make a major impact on how the P&L of the game looked.
Yeah, that's true.
I see.
And I do want to say, I want to reemphasize, Lauren Schick was great. And also just because it's great that you're talking to us, and I don't know who's going to listen to this, but the team that worked on this, the designers, the programmers, they worked their asses off right alongside us, and we're really terrific. So.
But you realize how short the list is. There's 6 artists on this project.
That's why they worked all night long.
It's crazy. That's crazy, yeah. And, a bunch of us are still friends from those days. Because we were all pretty young and we just worked and we were having fun.
Kelly and
Kelly Trout, now Kelly Kern. Yep, still friends with her. Bill Petras.
Quino Martin, Bill Petras.
Yep.
Yeah.
Quino's a professor now.
He's a professor of philosophy, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And we still work with the composer, Michael Bross.
Yeah, writing everything in MIDI.
You want to hear something else? I mean, it's still full circle. Some of the people at MicroProse I ended up working with when I was at Disney. They formed a new company, and some of the people spun off, and they did some handheld games for us. It's a very incestuous industry, but you also work with people that you know.
There was so much incest. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah. When you find good people you work with, we kept working with them.
It sounds like you really had a good time in that team back then. And it's interesting for me to hear, to be honest, that having the RPG elements in there was originally your idea and not a mandate, because I had the slight assumption that that was something that you were kind of forced to work with, maybe because it was the base of Challenge of the Five Realms, and then you just decided to take that technical base and work from there. But now it sounds like the RPG elements are something that you definitely wanted to have in there.
Yeah. It felt like the next step from that game.
It was just natural. I mean, we had been doing RPGs. We were also very story driven. So it was just like, of course, we're going to have RPG elements. And we just did it.
Okay. Because that brings me to
maybe
the most...
Here comes, maybe not well, but...
Segue. I feel it. Go ahead. Let's have it.
Well, that brings me to as I mentioned, to the fundamental question, actually, and it's not even a value judgment per se, but it's a question, because the more we played the game, the more we reached a point where we felt that there's a lot of RPG systems in the game, quite a lot. There is the very elaborate character creation process, the character sheet, the combat, the equipment system, the crafting, and so on. And then it took us quite a while of playing, hours of playing, to realize for the first time that the character skill values don't change. And it said in the manual that it would. The manual promised that by using skills like in combat or something, they would improve. And that's just not the case in the game. So that's the question. What happened there?
First of all, it does. You should play it again because it does. It does matter.
It does, but it does in a very intransparent manner and only in a minimal range.
I can't. This is where there's a blackout period. I don't remember. Where did we go wrong? I don't remember. The factors, those things affected, or the ranges weren't wide enough on all of the skills. I don't know.
Well, two things I would point out. And if you watch Big Bang Theory, there's an episode where they're making their girlfriends watch the first Indiana Jones. At the end of the movie, they observe that nothing Indiana Jones does in the movie actually makes any difference, because once the Nazis open up they die, so nothing he did. And so I think we're in good company. I honestly think, neither Laura or I were big RPG players. I did not play Dungeons and Dragons. I didn't study the systems. We were more writers and more interested in the story. And intellectually, I'm interested in the idea of systems and combat systems and points. And obviously, our whole economy is kind of like built on people, collecting things now. So I found that interesting. But as a person, I didn't really enjoy playing those things. So any defects we have in there, frankly, are probably because we weren't hardcore RPG folks.
The things that you liked about it, the way it was written, is because we weren't hardcore. And that's the same reason why you don't like the things that you don't like, because we weren't hardcore. So we had our weaknesses. We loved the writing so much, and maybe some of the other stuff suffered a bit.
Who designed the RPG systems, and in particular the combat?
I think we did with the programming team.
Okay. So there was no dedicated RPG designer or combat designer or something?
No, we were lean. We were running pretty lean.
I'm going to share a theory with you that we formed while playing, and you can then either accept it or disprove it.
Okay.
Because there was, I think, in the README file which came with the game, there was mentioned or implied that more random combat was supposed to happen, random combat on the Manhattan map and even in cyberspace. And so we concluded that that was cut out. And we assumed that it was cut out because combat is just so tedious and it's not really fun, and it's in the way of progressing in the game. And once you decided to cut that out, you realized that there's not much point in having the entire character system anymore if you don't have random combat and only a limited number of combat instances in the game. And then you decided to tone that back as well to just make it work. So is that theory valid, or is that completely wrong?
Are you saying that we sort of, in the README file, we sort of apologize for the combat system?
No, you did not. It's just, it's implied. No. The README file mentions that combat can occur in cyberspace, which doesn't happen in the game. So we thought that at the time when the README was written, which must have been towards the end of the production, I guess, that was still possible.
But the README is like the very last minute thing. That's the thing.
There was no combat in cyberspace. Yeah, you're right. There was no combat in cyberspace because we ran out of time probably. Yeah.
But you had that planned at some point.
Yeah. I have to say, though, just talking about README files is really making me happy. That's so awesome. I forgot all about that, but you would have to, like, towards the end, it's like, okay, let's write the README file. Shit, that's
Go ahead. I'm sorry you're disappointed in that, but it sounds like we were too.
Yeah, it sounds like we were too. Yeah.
You were definitely not apologizing. That's just the assumption that I had. But is it true that you had planned to have more combat and more random combat and combat in cyberspace and so on?
I think so, but like cyberspace was so hard to do. I think we were planning on having combat in cyberspace. And keep in mind, we were inventing our own idea of what cyberspace was. So commonplace now, but the idea of decking units and the idea of like interfacing your central nervous system with a computer, was so new. So I think it wasn't that we ran out of time. It was just like, I didn't know what combat would be here. We have plenty of it, good or bad. And so we just abandoned whatever we were planning there.
Let's talk about cyberspace briefly, because in the game, it's a physical location and a peculiar location in a way, and it has its own look. So you had to give it a form somehow. Do you still remember how this came about?
So it's not physical; it's notional. I would point that out. Okay. I think I'm teasing, but and again, this was like I didn't read any of the cyberpunk stuff. The whole idea of it was challenging, so we were trying to make it very much a notional space. We only had 3 discs and limited art resources to visualize it. And again, this was 1993. I mean, it was like, what does it even mean to hook your brain up to a computer? So we wrote all these pages about like how cyberspace works. I need to have wells and various things. And I remember Chris Short, who's one of the developers and a great guy, and he's like, well, you guys need to do some more work because I don't understand a thing you're talking about. Because it didn't make any sense because we were trying to figure it out.
What it visually looked like had to be the art team.
That was Quino, right? I mean, yeah. Quino Martin was the lead designer, big, strong, tattooed, dreadlocked guy.
Tats, but he means visual designers, art direction.
Yeah. And Quino owned a tattoo shop, so he would sit in his office in the summer with the air conditioning on and a blanket over him because it was too cold, even though it was 90 degrees outside. And then he would leave and go do tattoos and then show up at the bar at like, 10:30, 11 at night and slap down a big wad of cash that he had just made from giving people tattoos. But he was great.
Do you remember whether you already knew about the World Wide Web back then? Were you in the internet already?
No. Pre-internet.
Yeah, I was looking in the manual. We had a glossary in the back. This is Cyberpunk glossary. It says web, another name for cyberspace.
Really?
It's like a loop. Cyberspace. Listen to the definition for cyberspace. The place where computers interact with one another. Listen.
Accurate.
The space information travels from modem to modem.
Wow.
A virtual reality dimension.
Wow, I have to open my box up. I have one in my bedroom. It's still shrink wrap. I think we had we had no IT. Our developers strung a network up through the ceiling because we had developers who would port our games to other platforms, right? And some of them worked in other countries, and so occasionally we would have to upload source code to England so they could port it to the Amiga.
Amiga, yeah.
Yeah, and you would like set up the transfer at night and then hope that it didn't crash. So yeah, I think I got an AOL account like maybe a few months later.
Well, the way that cyberspace works in the game is not too far away from how the World Wide Web works. You just enter cyberspace, then you enter an address, and then you get to a val, which is basically the same as a website. But the way that cyberspace is used in the game, it's less about information. The theme of the game is more about your consciousness in that virtual space and being able to upload your consciousness and the consciousness being broken into parts or manipulated in that kind of dangerous space.
Yes. I think the decking units were called soul boxes, right? Or something like that.
Yep.
Yeah. In the decking unit, there were soul boxes. Correct.
Yeah. And you were a data angel when you were in cyberspace. Yeah. There was definitely about consciousness.
Coming back to the number of systems in the game briefly, because if I look at what's written about Bloodnet these days, there's quite a few retro reviews, let's plays and stuff like that. And whatever you read about the game, one word is almost certain to pop up, and that's the word ambitious. And in the context of Bloodnet, that's a bit of a double-edged word because it implies that the game tried to do a lot of innovative stuff, but ultimately it wasn't able to pull everything off. But my question would be, what was your ambition for the game? Did you have one?
I did, yeah. I mean, honestly, as far as creative things I've done, it's probably one of the most fun things I was involved in. But as Laura mentioned, like nobody was paying attention from an editorial standpoint. We had free range to do what we wanted to do. We were exploring something called cyberspace. We had vampires. We had psychotropic drugs. There was just so much to throw in there. So my ambition was just to fill the goddamn thing up with, pardon my language, but just fill it up with as much stuff I could pull out of my head. And, I think it was ambitious and it succeeded in some ways and didn't in others, but I'm really happy some people are still playing it. But my ambition was to have fun and throw as much stuff into it.
Yeah. Speaking as somebody that spent 16 years at Disney, where we did things with a lot of market research, and how many times did we have kids test the games and get their read on it? And on this, we made a game that we would want to play. That's what we did. Talk about a focus group, right?
Yeah. You don't realize at the time, it's like, okay, other than writing a novel where you're by yourself, just writing something and hoping someone will buy it, you don't get many opportunities to just do your thing and put it out there.
The interesting thing about Bloodnet is that having so many things in there, so many systems, and you, Laura, a while ago, you mentioned the word layered, and I think that's a very good term for the game. The interesting thing is that it succeeds at a couple of things which I'm not entirely sure whether they were by design or by accident rather. Because, for instance, we already talked about the number of party members and the decision to not have that much of a character development in terms of improving skills. Because your main character, Ransom Stark, when you start the game, he has pretty low stats and they don't grow much, if at all. And all of the other party members are much more powerful at any given time. So you want to have them. Your party is much more powerful than you are, and you rely on these people. And also because there's so many of them, and you sometimes need specific characters for specific situations, you also need to exchange them. So your companions and which you take along at which point in time has a lot more impact in that game than in other RPGs for the simple fact that your main character is weak. And that's great, actually. That's a very interesting gameplay experience. And I don't know whether that was by design. I assume not.
My honest answer is I don't remember, but I think it was by design. My personal, I'm a big comic book guy. Like, I love the Justice League, but I always loved the supporting characters like Green Arrow and Hawkman and the Atom. Like, get them in there. I mean, I love Batman and Superman, but it's like, right, they're great, but let me see what they can do. So I don't know that we consciously sat down and talked about it, but from my own standpoint, the lead characters to me are always less interesting than what, Hawkman or the Atom can bring to the party. So I think some of that was by intention.
I think we were concerned with making sure that you needed to use all the members of your party so much, so we toned down the lead character. I can't remember. I think that might have been a happy accident, I guess.
How interesting is Ransom Stark? He's the player, right? The player's character. And then the NPCs are where all the interesting things were.
The interesting thing about Ransom Stark as the protagonist of the game is that he's not a blank slate. He is a character, most definitely, and the way he talks, he has a lot of dialogue, gives him that character. But the most fascinating thing about him in the game is that everybody seems to know him. He really is somebody who is almost prominent in the subculture that he moves in this circle of deckers and rage gangers, etc. And from a player perspective, that's a very interesting experience because when you go to a new location and meet new people, you also learn more about your main character because they know him and they're going to tell you as the player new stuff about your character. They're going to provide context, essentially.
I seem to remember us wanting to skip that step where he has to explain himself upon every introduction. Like, it was so tedious.
Right.
Just to remind everybody, this is my quest, this is who I am, and we just ditched all that by making everybody already be acquainted with everybody. Didn't we do that on purpose?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. The game had enough writing in it and was wordy enough as it was. So, yeah, having to, your
backstory every time. We skipped that.
Yeah, I think, you're right.
Well, that was definitely a good decision then. Let's talk about the very other end of the story, the grand finale, the fight against Dracula. And then the resolution of the story is that you meet in cyberspace with the character who's supposed to heal you from your vampire curse. And then rather than being healed, there's this cliffhanger ending where Incubus becomes a sentient being and the new threat to Manhattan, essentially. So why that ending?
So how did you feel when that happens? It just feels like we pulled a bait and switch on you? I can't remember that. Do you remember that, John? Why did we do that?
No, I know it was your idea, so but no.
Were we just like, oh, this will really be a twist? We didn't think of it as the big screw you.
I don't remember the ending, but my guess is we were assuming we were going to do a sequel. And so we were leaving the door open for franchise building. And we ended up not doing, MicroProse went out of business and all that. And we ended up not doing Bloodnet, but we did 2 other games that were in the Cyberpunk genre, Hell and Ripper. So those were our sequels. That was our trilogy of Cyberpunk games. But I think we were probably just leaving the door open for some kind of, to bring Ransom Stark back and to do a sequel. In fact, I think we even had somewhere out there, I think there's a box that says like Bloodnet 2000 or something. But that's about as far as it got.
Did you have any concrete idea of how the story would have continued?
No, I didn't.
We must have. Somewhere it's in a spiral notebook somewhere. I don't remember.
But also when you do these games, I'm sure it's still the same way now. I mean, we've both been out of the industry for a long time. When you finish these games, you were exhausted. You were barely getting them out the door, right? When you finished them, it was like, again, this is a long time ago. There was no internet. Like you weren't delivering your code over a network. You had to burn it on a CD, send it out to be mastered. And that thing had to be right because once it was mastered, that's it. So by the time you finish these things, you are completely exhausted and really just glad to be rid of it. So, yeah. I mean, it's not like the theater where the curtain goes up or even a book where there's like a publishing party. You push these things out in the middle of the night and they burn the CD and then you go home and sleep for a week and move on to the next one.
Did you get feedback back then about the game?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There'd be reviews in magazines.
Probably got some letters on paper.
And we had a support line, so people would call in. I mean, often that was just because they were having trouble with their video card or something. But you would get feedback. But yeah, the game was well reviewed.
And was it successful?
Yes. I don't remember the sales numbers. Scale was small. I remember it being like if you sold 150,000 of them, you were doing all right and making money.
Okay. You mentioned, John, being exhausted at the end of the production, and that kind of answers another question which I had, because in particular towards the end of the gameplay experience, it feels kind of rushed at the end. I mean, I already mentioned the ending is not really satisfying, but there's a couple of loose ends. There are some quests which go nowhere, essentially. There's a couple of artifacts in the game which seem to be left over from an idea which you had but didn't implement. So we had the impression that you were under some kind of time pressure, that production time was simply over and MicroProse forced you to release it. Was that the case?
No.
Did we build everything chronologically? I don't know. Maybe.
What do you mean by chronologically?
It's not necessarily saying that the end of the game was done near the end as we approached the deadline.
We were trapped by chronologies. That's true. Yeah.
But it's not like Microsoft was the big bad HQ. It was more like it had to be done in time to get in the boxes for Christmas.
Yeah.
It means November before Thanksgiving. And you never have enough time.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't rushed for corporate reasons. And I don't even think it was rushed. It's just you have deadlines and you're producing on a deadline, right? You have to get it done. So it wasn't rushed, but we were absolutely on a deadline. And I think to Laura's point, we weren't doing it chronologically, but, exhaustion does set in at a certain point and a few things get left out.
Plus, we cast the net really wide. So if we had kept it a little bit leaner, we could have gone in and just made those tracks absolutely perfect, but we just scattered it so wide and so far. And then once you did, you couldn't clip those out without having all these domino effects. It could affect other things. You couldn't just yank out an entire thread. Remember that?
Yeah, you're right.
You had to see it through. So that's when we would skimp on how deep each thing went, because you couldn't just pull it out. You just had to do it, and you ended up doing it lighter than you had intended. So that's why it comes across like that.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, one of these loose ends is that the manual has this kind of mission statement in the beginning of what Ransom Stark has to accomplish in the game, or potentially can accomplish in the game, like being cured of his vampirism. And one of these things is the question, can you find love? And well, the answer to that from our playthrough is no, because we couldn't. So we were wondering, who would the love interest have been? Did we miss something?
Wow, find love. Oh my God, yeah.
Do we have that in there?
We were obviously young. We were obviously very young. And yeah, and you're right. And you're right. The answer is no. Wow. Yeah, Laura, you want to take that one?
I remember, this sounds really sad, but I remember manual going to print way earlier than having to replicate the discs. You remember that?
No.
So that's why there's some things out of sync with the manual and with the actual game. But I don't even remember striving some kind of romantic aspect. I don't know. Did Ransom Stark have a girlfriend? Do you remember?
They were just little sprites. It was hard to be pretty sexy with just those little tiny sprites.
Not only is he a vampire, but he's lonely as hell. Sorry. Yeah. We left out that entire aspect of him.
Well, there is Melissa Van Helsing. There's this femme fatale in the game, and she at some point confesses her love, but then she betrays him and so on, and you can't really save her. At least I think you can't, because she dies in the combat. And then there's your ex-girlfriend, Monique, also in the game, but there's not really a spark between them. So there would be characters where some romance would have been possible, but unfortunately there is none in the game as far as we could find.
Yeah, no.
No.
John, you mentioned that it's difficult to be sexy with these tiny sprites, but I have to say that one of the things which are really nice about the game is the character portraits, even though they're pretty tiny, but the pixel art in them is great, actually. So they're really nice to look at. But on the other hand, one thing that we found a bit jarring is that there's different art styles in the game. Like there's this beautiful pixel art, but then there's the backgrounds which are pre-rendered and are relatively cool and have less detail in them. And then there's the beautiful map of Manhattan. But then you have the sprites on those backgrounds, which are rather clunky. So it doesn't fit that well.
You're right. Oh, man, I love that map.
The map, yes.
Yeah, the map is beautiful.
Quino made that map. I love that map. I forgot all about that. Yeah.
And you're right. We were trying to use 3D and then those little portraits. Remember the love and care that went into that? By the way, a lot of those portraits are people from The Office, right?
It's all real people. Yeah, that's pretty much the staff of The Office. Their family members or photography we use without any licenses.
So are the two of you in there as well?
I did. I had a character.
Yeah, my wedding picture's in there. I think I'm Ransom Stark.
I think mine was a hacker or something, but I had big hair, late 80s fashion. We put ourselves in there. We did little cameos.
With that map, that's of Manhattan, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. Back then, Manhattan was still scary. You could still make it scary.
Oh, yeah.
Even the idea of just digging into Manhattan and remaking that, I don't think you could do that today because it's all calamari bars and whatever. But it was just going back to how different things were. Like even just playing around in Manhattan just felt like such a fun thing to do.
Right. And I was in New York before you were. I lived there in 87, 88.
Right.
Back when it was really dangerous to live there.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
No, she committed a number of crimes.
Graffiti on the subway trains and stuff like that.
Well, that's the least of it. The least of it.
You're right. You were talking about the merging of art styles. And we thought, I think at the time we thought that was, look, we're putting in this 2D RPG stuff, but there's no reason we can't have beautiful backgrounds. And the artists had fun with that. And we also wanted the portraits to look really nice because that was going to give you your feeling of that with the dialogue. That's all you had to work with. And so I guess we were trying to do a mashup of it. And you're right, it is a little jarring, but that 3D stuff was still kind of new at the time. So we thought we were being pretty avant-garde, remember?
That was our first game. It was pre-rendered stuff, but that was the first game I think we did with 3D Studios. Challenge of the Five Realms and everything else was done with paint programs.
It does give it a kind of a unique style, but it also hasn't aged that well, unfortunately.
No, there's no way it could. There's no way it could. I mean, again, keep in mind, like this was pre-3D Studios Max. There wasn't even a preview function. The designers had to design something and then
rendered for hours.
And if it was wrong, if the arm or the shoulder was wrong, they'd go back in and then pull on the triangles and then render it out again and look at it. So it was really a terrible thing for them. That's why they were there all night long.
It does add to the etchy atmosphere that the game has. And I mean, atmosphere is definitely also one of the really strong sides. The writing adds into that, the entire setting, the darkness, etc. But ultimately, I mean, if I had to summarize my fascination with the game and what I really liked about it, it's that the number of systems that you put in there and all of the stuff which you put in there, all of the characters, all of the dialogues, the quests, and the openness and dynamic nature of the game world, that creates an impression of impressive depth. Because there are so many possible interconnections. The game implies that my decisions actually matter. The world may change based on at what time I visit what location with what character in my party and how I handled such and such previous situation. And the game does provide examples of that, even in the very beginning. So if I have that cyborg character, Nimrod, in my party, for instance, then most people in the game world won't talk to me because he's a killer. And if I sell drugs to one kid in Central Park to Dodger, then he dies and I can't recruit him. So there's consequence. And there's this implication that the game tracks a huge range of causes and effects. And I think this fantasy is immensely fascinating and captivating to a certain type of player, such as me. And I think that's the reason why, for example, when Melissa Van Helsing dies in that battle in Grant's Tomb, which I mentioned, that it's entirely conceivable to me as a player that there may be some way to save her, just provided that I uncover the correct conditions. And that promise of efficacy is at the core of the game's appeal, I feel, because Bloodnet succeeds better than many other games at maintaining that illusion for quite a while. Through its wonderful non-linearity, for instance, and also through its inherent danger, because it allows you to kill quest givers and sell quest items and ruin the game, but it doesn't hold your hand. I mean, it lets you continue until you reach a dead end, and that's intriguing. Ultimately, there's few decisions in the game which actually lead to significant different outcomes, but it takes a long time till you realize that, and along the way, you have a lot of fun.
Oh, wow.
That's awesome, man.
What a wonderful thing to say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're
Wow.
welcome. Thank you for making the game because we really had a good time with it.
I'm thrilled you played it and you enjoyed it and that we're talking about it. That's just really great.
That makes me so happy. And when you say all these things, I realize that it would be so hard to do that same thing today. So much of everything I've done since has always had to have design by committee and, everybody checking in along the way. The fact that we were small and that we kind of didn't 100% know what we were doing led to all those things you say, but also led to the things that disappointed you. But we couldn't even have either of those things happen in today's climate, the way the industry is. So it was kind of a weird, perfect little time. And that just makes me so happy.
Yeah. If I could go back and redo one thing in my career, I'd love to go back and just do Bloodnet again, with new technology and explore the world more. As Laura said, it was just a lot of fun.
It would be amazing if that were to happen, because one of the reasons why many people like us consider Bloodnet a diamond in the rough is because it's that kind of unfulfilled promise. There's a nucleus of a fantastic game, and in many ways it succeeds, but in some ways it doesn't. So there's that huge promise that ultimately is unfulfilled, and it's that huge what-if scenario. What if somebody were to make a game like that with a bit more time and a bit more polish? Wouldn't that be the perfect game? Something like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, just need a few $100,000 and we're right on that. No, thank you. No, it was a lot of fun. So happy to be talking about it.
Well, you're very welcome. To wrap up, you already mentioned that you continue to work on Cyberpunk games. So had you found your favorite genre there?
I mean, it was mine. I was never a big fantasy person. Space fair stuff is fine, but it's not tied to Earth. So once I learned what Cyberpunk was, I was happy to do 3 straight Cyberpunk games. Hell wasn't very successful. Ripper, we went straight into adventure games. I think it could have benefited from having a combat system. But I love the whole idea of technology married to whether it be vampires or demons or Jack the Ripper. I thought that was just fertile ground. So I enjoyed that.
And I went off in a different direction. After Hell, Take-Two had a brief foray into kids' games.
Yes.
I took that on. Didn't do so well, and they didn't want anything to do with it afterward, but that's what led me to Disney. And then I had 16 years of making games at Disney on all platforms after that. And I used all these skills that we developed in that room doing this game. Anything after that was was a piece of cake after we had done every aspect of everything like that. I found myself able to use that for the kids' games. And I ended up liking that too. And talk about a whole different, going from vampire cyberpunks. And then after that, I was working with, Dalmatian puppies and the Little Mermaid. But I'm glad that we did what we did in the year that we did, or it wouldn't have led to that.
I think I tried to help you. I think Bill Cosby's Picture Pages was a license we had. And incredibly enough, we were making a computer game and then doing that at night. That was our night project. And Laura was terrific at it. And I was supposed to write some dialogue for kids. I sucked at it. I remember.
That was not your forte.
I remember Laura, I turned in my script and Laura's like, John, don't get mad at me. I had to mark it up. I'm like, I don't care. I suck at this. It's completely terrible.
They were just complicated. I was like, you can't write for kids with all these clauses in the sentence. I follow you.
So, yeah, we kind of diverged after that.
And when and why did your time in the games industry end?
Because it's a shitty business, man.
John got out. I spent 16 years at Disney, and then I left the corporate game, but now I just do freelance work. But John got out of games business a while ago. He became a full-out grown-up.
Yeah, no, I live in New York, so I didn't want to move. Like, there's not much of a games business in New York, and you are working long hours. And at a certain point, if you move up in the business, you're not doing the creative work anymore. So It's like, well, I don't really want. If I'm going to project manage or executive manage a sports game, then I might as well do something else. And that's when the internet hit in like the 90s. So I joined up with RGA, which was a big web agency, still is the largest web agency in the world, and moved out of the games business like back in the 90s, 99, last century.
The thing that you mentioned there, that's what happened to me. After I did several games hands-on myself, that's what they do. They move you up and you move further and further away from the actual creative. And it's a step up, but yet it's sad because you don't get to do the fun stuff as much anymore.
You might as well be selling raviolis, right? I mean, it's not that different. You're moving widgets out at that point. It's not fun anymore.
I did miss the hands-on stuff, and doing the flashbacks to the things we did on this game. Looking at it has been fun because the volume of work we did in a short amount of time. We did a lot. We sure did a lot, and it was a lot of fun.
You sure did. So finally, as a kind of final judgment about the game, if you look back, I mean, it's been 25 years since Bloodnet was released. That's a long time. So if you look back at the game and the time of its creation, what is your primary emotion?
Oh, from this call is true definition of nostalgia, which is it's painful, but you don't mind it. And I just have fond memories of that time because it also means a time in my life when we were moving and shaking. We were working like crazy. Everybody was a group of close-knit friends, and we were so proud of what we were doing. And it was just a glorious time. It was a glorious time. So this has been a fun revisiting of that happy time in my life.
Yeah, everything Laura said. And the other thing I look back at is I marvel at how focused I could be. There was no internet. My computer was not linked to anything. Just go into a room and focus and create stuff all day long. That level of focus and enthusiasm and mission was great.
We were really lucky.
And yes, thank you for letting us relive it.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for sharing all of this. It was such a pleasure talking to you. And if I were you, I would also look back at that time and that project with pride, I think, because you have created something lasting, something that people enjoy to this day and will continue to enjoy in the future, something that has its place in the history of gaming. It may not be entirely up there near the top, but it is something unique and something that creates enjoyment for the people who play it. And it certainly did for us. And it was a wonderful opportunity to talk to you and get a couple of these questions answered, which we had while we were playing it. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Christian.